Banned at his peak, Muhammad Ali refused war and lost everything. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. To understand why Muhammad Ali's refusal to serve in the Vietnam War shook America to its core, one must understand the America of the mid-1960s, a nation divided along fault lines of race, war, and social change that threatened to tear the country apart. By 1966, the United States was deeply entrenched in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson had escalated American involvement dramatically, with over 385,000 troops deployed and casualty numbers rising weekly. The war was sold to the American public as a fight against communist expansion, a necessary intervention to prevent the spread of Soviet and Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. Young men were being drafted by the hundreds of thousands, sent to fight in a jungle war thousands of miles from home. But not all Americans supported the war. A growing anti-war movement, initially concentrated on college campuses, was beginning to gain mainstream traction. The civil rights movement, having achieved legislative victories with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, was fragmenting over questions of tactics and whether the fight for racial justice at home was compatible with fighting wars abroad. Into this volatile environment stepped Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., known to the world as Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, Olympic gold medalist, and the most recognizable athlete on the planet. Ali was 24 years old, undefeated in 19 professional fights, and at the absolute peak of his physical powers. He defeated Sonny Liston twice to claim and defend his heavyweight title, establishing himself as not just a great fighter, but a cultural phenomenon whose brash personality and quick wit made him a media darling. But Ali was also a controversial figure. In 1964, immediately after defeating Liston, he denounced his conversion to the Nation of Islam, a black Muslim organization led by Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam preached black self-reliance, separation from white society, and rejection of integration as a solution to racial inequality. Ali had changed his name from Cassius Clay, which he called his slave name, to Muhammad Ali, embracing his new religious identity publicly and unapologetically. This conversion alarmed many white Americans and disappointed some civil rights leaders who favored integration. The Nation of Islam was viewed with suspicion and hostility by mainstream America. Its rhetoric about white people as devils and its rejection of nonviolent integration tactics associated with Martin Luther King Jr. made it seem threatening and radical. Ali's embrace of this organization transformed him from a charming, if arrogant, athlete into a figure associated with black nationalism and religious extremism. The selective service system, which administered the military draft, had originally classified Ali as unfit for service in 1964 due to poor performance on mental aptitude tests. This classification, one way, indicating he'd only be called in a national emergency, allowed Ali to continue his boxing career without military obligations. But as the war escalated and manpower needs increased, the military lowered its qualifying standards. In February 1966, Ali was reclassified as 1A, meaning he was eligible for immediate induction. The reclassification triggered a firestorm. At a press conference in Miami on 17th of February 1966, a reporter asked Ali about his new draft status. His response became one of the most famous quotes in American sports history. "Man, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." The statement was explosive. In a single sentence, Ali had connected the war in Vietnam to racial injustice in America, suggesting that the real enemy wasn't communist Vietnamese, but racist Americans. He was articulating a position that many black Americans felt, but few public figures dared express. Why should black men fight for a country that denied them basic rights and dignity? The reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Newspapers across the country condemned Ali. Politicians called him a traitor and coward. Veterans groups demanded he be stripped of his title. Former supporters turned against him. The boxing establishment, already uncomfortable with his religious conversion and outspoken personality, saw an opportunity to punish him for stepping out of the acceptable role for black athletes. What many white Americans failed to understand was that Ali's position resonated deeply within black communities. African Americans had served in every American war since the Revolution, often in segregated units and always facing discrimination. They'd returned from World War II and Korea to find the same racism and segregation they'd left. Now young black men were being drafted at disproportionate rates to fight in Vietnam, whilst facing police brutality, economic discrimination, and political disenfranchisement at home. Ali applied for conscientious objector status, arguing that his religious beliefs as a Muslim prohibited him from participating in war. This was a legitimate legal category recognized by selective service regulations. Individuals whose religious training and belief made them conscientiously opposed to war in any form could be exempted from combat service, though they might still be required to serve in non-combat roles. The application faced immediate skepticism. Conscientious objector status had traditionally been granted primarily to members of historically pacifist religions like Quakers and Mennonites. The Nation of Islam wasn't recognized as a pacifist organization. Indeed, it advocated for black self-defense and wasn't opposed to violence in principle. The question became whether Ali's individual religious beliefs qualified him for exemption, regardless of his organization's broader teachings. His case was heard by a special hearing officer appointed by the Department of Justice, Judge Lawrence Grauman, in August 1966. Grauman conducted extensive interviews with Ali and reviewed testimony about his religious beliefs and the Nation of Islam's teachings. In a detailed report, Grauman recommended that Ali be granted conscientious objector status, finding that his beliefs were sincere and met the legal requirements. However, the Department of Justice disagreed with its own hearing officer's recommendation, an almost unprecedented occurrence. The Justice Department advised the appeal board to reject Ali's claim, arguing that his objection wasn't truly based on religious training and belief. The appeal board, composed of white Kentucky businessmen with no expertise in Islamic theology or conscientious objector law, followed the Justice Department's recommendation and denied Ali's application. This set the stage for what would become one of the most consequential confrontations between an athlete and the government in American history. The day everything was taken. The morning of 28th of April 1967 in Houston, Texas, began like any other spring day in the American South. Warm, humid, with no outward sign that this would become one of the most significant days in American sports and civil rights history. But by the end of that day, Muhammad Ali would lose his heavyweight championship, his boxing license, his ability to earn a living, and face federal criminal prosecution that could send him to prison for 5 years. Ali had been ordered to report to the Armed Forces Examining and Entrance Station in Houston for induction into the United States Army. The order came despite his pending appeal of the denial of his conscientious objector application. Standard procedure would have been to delay induction until appeals were exhausted, but the government was determined to force the issue. Ali's legal team had filed motions requesting postponement, but all were denied. He would report or face immediate prosecution. The scene outside the induction center that morning was chaotic. Reporters, photographers, and television crews from around the world had gathered, along with supporters holding signs reading "Stay Home Muhammad," and counter-protesters carrying American flags and signs calling Ali a coward. Police maintained order as Ali arrived with his entourage, including his lawyer, manager, and members of the Nation of Islam. Inside the facility, Ali underwent the standard induction procedures alongside other young men being processed that day. The contrast was stark. Most inductees were working-class men with no choice in the matter, whilst Ali was a millionaire celebrity whose refusal would make global headlines. The process included paperwork, medical checks, and eventually the crucial moment, the oath ceremony. 26 men were called forward in alphabetical order to take one step forward when their name was called, symbolizing their acceptance of induction into the armed forces. When the officer called Cassius Marcellus Clay, Ali remained motionless. The officer repeated the name twice more. Ali didn't move. The silence in the room was absolute. Ali was taken to a separate room and informed of the consequences of his refusal. A lieutenant read him a written statement explaining that refusal to submit to induction was a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Ali was given multiple opportunities to reconsider. Each time, he calmly stated that his religious beliefs prevented him from accepting induction. He handed the officer a written statement explaining his position. The statement read, in part, "I am a member of the Muslims, and we don't go to war unless they are declared by Allah himself. I don't have no personal quarrel with those Viet Congs. I'm not trying to dodge the draft. We are not supposed to take part in no wars unless declared by Allah or the Messenger." At approximately 2 p.m., Ali left the induction center having formally refused induction. The legal and professional consequences began immediately, faster than anyone could have anticipated. The machinery of the boxing establishment and federal prosecution had been prepared in advance, ready to move the moment Ali made his final decision. Within hours, the New York State Athletic Commission announced it was suspending Ali's boxing license and stripping him of his heavyweight title. This was extraordinary on multiple levels. Ali had not been convicted of any crime. He'd merely been charged. The presumption of innocence, a bedrock principle of American justice, was ignored. Moreover, the Athletic Commission had no jurisdiction over Ali's actions in Houston. He hadn't violated any boxing regulations. He simply made a decision about military service that the Commission disapproved of. But the Commission's action reflected the political climate of the era. Boxing regulators saw an opportunity to punish a fighter many considered arrogant and unpatriotic. The statement announcing the decision declared that Ali's refusal to serve was detrimental to the best interests of boxing. This established a precedent that an athlete's political or religious beliefs, even when not related to their sport, could justify professional sanctions. Other state athletic commissions quickly followed New York's lead. Within days, every major boxing jurisdiction in the United States had suspended Ali's license. This didn't just prevent him from fighting for a title, it prevented him from boxing anywhere in the country, at any level, for any purse. His ability to earn a living through the only profession he'd ever known was eliminated completely. The World Boxing Association, one of the sport's major sanctioning bodies, stripped Ali of their recognition as champion. The World Boxing Council followed suit. Ali was now the former champion, despite never having been defeated in the ring. His titles taken by athletic commissions and sanctioning organizations rather than by any opponent. The federal prosecution moved with equal speed. On 8th of May 1967, a grand jury in Houston indicted Ali on charges of refusing induction into the armed forces. The trial was scheduled for 20th of June 1967, less than 2 months after his refusal. This rapid timeline gave Ali's legal team minimal time to prepare a defense, though the outcome was never really in doubt given the political climate. The trial itself was brief and largely pro forma. Ali's defense centered on his sincere religious beliefs, qualifying him for conscientious objector status. The prosecution argued that his beliefs didn't meet the legal requirements and that his refusal was based on political opposition to the Vietnam War rather than religious conviction. Judge Joe Ingram, who had a son serving in Vietnam, made no effort to hide his hostility toward Ali. The all-white jury deliberated for just 20 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Ingram immediately sentenced Ali to the maximum penalty, 5 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. Ali's legal team filed notice of appeal, which meant he would remain free on bail whilst the case proceeded through higher courts. But the conviction stood. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. Ali's boxing purses had made him wealthy, but his expenses were also enormous. He supported his family, provided financial assistance to the Nation of Islam, maintained a large entourage, and lived extravagantly. Without boxing income, his financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Endorsement deals evaporated. Appearance fees dried up. His investments, poorly managed, lost value. More painful than the financial loss was the public condemnation. Ali was vilified in newspapers across the country. Politicians competed to denounce him in the harshest terms. Governor George Wallace of Alabama said Ali should be put away in the penitentiary. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia called him a detriment to his race. Congressional representatives introduced legislation specifically targeting draft resistors, with Ali clearly the intended target. Even some civil rights leaders distanced themselves from Ali. While they might privately sympathize with his position, publicly supporting someone convicted of draft evasion was politically dangerous in 1967 America. Martin Luther King Jr., who would later speak out strongly against the Vietnam War, initially made no public statements supporting Ali. 3 years in exile, the wilderness, years from April 1967 to October 1970, Muhammad Ali was banned from the only profession he'd ever known. He was 25 years old when the ban began, precisely the age when heavyweight champions typically reach their physical peak. By the time he was allowed to fight again, he'd be 28, with 3.5 years of inactivity and the inevitable deterioration that comes from time away from elite competition. The boxing world moved on without him. The heavyweight division, which Ali had dominated so completely, descended into chaos. The various sanctioning bodies recognized different champions. Joe Frazier emerged as the most legitimate title holder, winning an elimination tournament and establishing himself as a dominant force. But everyone understood the reality. The real champion was in exile, forbidden from defending a title he'd never lost in the ring. Ali's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. His lavish lifestyle during his championship years had been funded by enormous purses that now ceased completely. He'd earned approximately $6 million in his boxing career, extraordinary wealth for the 1960s, but had spent almost all of it. Poor investments, generous support of friends and family, contributions to the Nation of Islam, and simple extravagance had left him with minimal savings. Without boxing income, he faced genuine financial hardship. The Internal Revenue Service compounded his problems by demanding payment of back taxes. The IRS claimed Ali owed substantial sums on his previous fight purses, threatening liens on his property if payment wasn't made. The irony was cruel. The government that had taken away his ability to earn money was simultaneously demanding payment of taxes on money he'd already spent. Ali's response was to reinvent himself as a public speaker. He began accepting invitations to speak at college campuses, initially for modest fees, but eventually commanding several $1,000s per appearance. This was the era of widespread campus activism against the Vietnam War. And Ali found receptive audiences amongst students who saw him as a hero for standing up to governmental authority. His speaking style was remarkable. Without formal education beyond high school, Ali nonetheless possessed natural charisma and the ability to articulate complex ideas about race, religion, and war in ways that resonated with young audiences. He spoke about the hypocrisy of asking black men to fight for freedom abroad when they lacked basic rights at home. He connected the war in Vietnam to economic exploitation and racial injustice. He defended his religious beliefs with passion and eloquence. These speaking tours took Ali to universities across America, Berkeley, Harvard, Howard, and dozens of others. At predominantly white institutions, he challenged students to examine their own complicity in systems of oppression. At historically black colleges, he urged students to take pride in their heritage and resist the draft. His message was consistent. The war was wrong, and young men of all races should refuse to participate in it. The campus speaking circuit did more than provide income. It transformed Ali's public image, at least amongst younger Americans. Where older, more conservative Americans saw a draft dodger and black militant, college students increasingly saw a principled dissenter willing to sacrifice everything for his beliefs. The shift in public opinion about Ali paralleled the broader shift in American attitudes toward the Vietnam War itself. By 1968, the war had become deeply unpopular. The Tet Offensive in January and February demonstrated that despite official optimism about American progress, the war was far from won. Casualty numbers continued rising. The draft became increasingly controversial as middle-class and wealthy families began losing sons. Television brought images of the war's brutality into American living rooms nightly. Against this backdrop, Ali's position began to seem less radical and more prescient. His 1966 statement about having no quarrel with the Viet Cong was echoed by growing numbers of Americans who questioned why their sons were dying in Southeast Asian jungles. The anti-war movement, once confined to college campuses and leftist organizations, moved into the mainstream. Martin Luther King Jr.'s evolution on the war was particularly significant. In April 1967, exactly when Ali was refusing induction, King delivered his famous Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church in New York, explicitly connecting civil rights to opposition to the war. King's stance cost him support amongst moderate whites and the Johnson administration, but it aligned him with Ali's position. Though King never publicly endorsed Ali's refusal to serve, the parallel was obvious. The legal battle over Ali's conviction continued through the federal court system. His lawyers argued that the denial of conscientious objector status was improper, that the appeal board had failed to provide specific reasons for rejecting the recommendation of the Justice Department's own hearing officer, and that Ali's religious beliefs were sincere and met legal requirements for exemption. The government maintained that Ali's beliefs didn't qualify because the Nation of Islam wasn't a pacifist organization, and Ali's objection was political rather than religious. Appeals proceeded through the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which upheld the conviction, and eventually to the United States Supreme Court. The process took years, during which Ali remained free on bail but unable to box. Each legal setback was another blow to his hopes of returning to the ring. During these years, Ali's personal life also evolved. His marriage to Sonji Roy had ended in divorce in 1966, partly due to conflicts over her unwillingness to adopt the strict dress codes and religious practices required by the Nation of Islam. In 1967, Ali married Belinda Boyd, who converted to Islam and took the name Khalila Ali. They would have 4 children together during the exile years. The Nation of Islam remained central to Ali's life, though his relationship with the organization was complex. Elijah Muhammad, the organization's leader, supported Ali's draft resistance, but also expected total loyalty and substantial financial contributions. Ali was a valuable asset to the nation. His fame brought attention and legitimacy to the organization, but he was also constrained by its demands and sometimes struggled with its rigid doctrines. By 1970, pressure was building to allow Ali to return to boxing. The war had become so unpopular that his stance seemed less controversial. A new generation of activists and politicians sympathetic to Ali's position had emerged. Boxing promoters recognized that Ali Frazier would be one of the most lucrative fights in history, and they lobbied athletic commissions to lift the ban. The breakthrough came in Georgia, which uniquely had no state athletic commission. Senator Leroy Johnson, one of the few black state legislators in the South, worked behind the scenes to arrange a fight in Atlanta. Without a commission to grant or deny licenses, local officials could approve the bout. After 3.5 years of forced exile, Muhammad Ali would finally be allowed to fight again. The return and the first fall. On 26 October 1970, Muhammad Ali stepped into a boxing ring at the Municipal Auditorium in Atlanta, Georgia, for the first time in 3.5 years. His opponent was Jerry Quarry, a skilled white heavyweight contender known as the Bellflower Bomber. The fight represented far more than a sporting contest. It was Ali's return from exile, a test of whether he could reclaim what had been taken from him. The Georgia loophole that made the fight possible was both clever and controversial. Because the state had no athletic commission, there was no regulatory body with authority to deny Ali a license. Senator Leroy Johnson, one of Georgia's first black state senators since Reconstruction, had lobbied Atlanta Mayor Sam Massell and assembled a group of local businessmen to sponsor the bout. The fight would be regulated by a hastily assembled local commission created specifically for this event. Boxing authorities in states with commissions were furious. The New York State Athletic Commission, which had led the campaign to strip Ali of his license, condemned Georgia for allowing a convicted felon to box. But Georgia proceeded anyway, and suddenly other jurisdictions began reconsidering their bans. If Georgia could allow Ali to fight, their own prohibitions looked increasingly untenable. The fight itself drew enormous attention. The arena was packed with celebrities, politicians, and civil rights leaders. Television coverage was extensive. Everyone wanted to see whether Ali, after 43 months away from competition, could still perform at championship level. The questions were genuine. Could a fighter maintain elite skills without sparring, without real competition, without the intensity that only actual fights provide? Ali answered those questions decisively. He stopped Quarry in the third round with a cut above Quarry's eye so severe that the referee had no choice but to halt the contest. Ali's speed remained remarkable, his combinations sharp, his movement fluid. He looked like he'd been fighting continuously rather than sitting idle for over 3 years. The performance was a statement. Muhammad Ali was back, and he was still dangerous. 6 weeks later, on 7th of December 1970, Ali fought Oscar Bonavena in New York City. Madison Square Garden, the same venue where the New York Athletic Commission had stripped his title, now hosted his return. The commission had quietly reinstated his license, recognizing that maintaining the ban was no longer politically or economically viable. Ali stopped Bonavena in the 15th round, his first knockout victory since returning. These victories set up what everyone wanted: Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier for the undisputed heavyweight championship. Frazier had emerged during Ali's exile as the legitimate champion, winning an elimination tournament and defending the title successfully. He was undefeated in 26 fights, all but 2 ending in knockouts. His style, relentless forward pressure, devastating left hook, iron chin, made him an extremely dangerous opponent. The bout was scheduled for 8th of March 1971 at Madison Square Garden, billed as the fight of the century. It was the first time 2 undefeated heavyweight champions faced each other. The political symbolism was impossible to ignore. Frazier was embraced by mainstream America as the good champion, patriotic, apolitical, non-threatening. Ali remained controversial despite his comeback. The draft conviction was still on appeal, and many Americans still considered him a traitor. The build-up was venomous. Ali engaged in psychological warfare that crossed lines of decency. He called Frazier ignorant and ugly. He labeled him a Uncle Tom and a tool of white establishment. The attacks wounded Frazier deeply. He'd actually supported Ali during the exile, arguing that Ali should be allowed to fight. The cruelty of Ali's pre-fight rhetoric created a bitterness between the two men that never fully healed. The fight lived up to its billing. For 15 brutal rounds, two undefeated champions waged war under the brightest lights boxing had ever seen. Ali started fast, using his speed and jab to frustrate Frazier. But Frazier kept coming, walking through Ali's punches, targeting Ali's body, gradually breaking him down. By the middle rounds, the pattern was clear. Ali's skills remained superior, but his conditioning wasn't quite what it had been before the layoff. 3.5 years away from elite competition had taken a toll. He couldn't maintain the pace he'd once set. His legs, which had carried him through so many fights, began to tire. Frazier sensed the opportunity and increased his pressure. His left hook to the body punished Ali, draining his stamina. In the 11th round, Frazier hurt Ali badly with combinations to the head. Ali survived, but was clearly in trouble. The 15th and final round brought the fight's defining moment. With both men exhausted and the decision uncertain, Frazier landed the most famous punch of his career, a left hook that caught Ali flush on the jaw and lifted him off his feet. Ali crashed to the canvas, the first time he'd been knocked down in his professional career. Ali rose immediately, proving his incredible toughness. He survived the round, but the knockdown sealed Frazier's victory. The judge's decision was unanimous. Joe Frazier had defeated Muhammad Ali, handing Ali his first professional loss and cementing Frazier's position as legitimate heavyweight champion. The defeat was devastating for Ali on multiple levels. He'd returned from exile believing he would immediately reclaim his throne. Instead, he'd been beaten fairly and decisively by a fighter who proved superior on that night. The loss raised questions about whether the exile had permanently diminished Ali's abilities. But even as Ali dealt with the immediate disappointment, his legal battle reached its climax. On 28th June 1971, just months after the Frazier defeat, the United States Supreme Court issued its decision in Clay v. United States. In an 8-0 ruling, Justice Thurgood Marshall recused himself due to his previous position as Solicitor General. The court overturned Ali's conviction. The decision was narrow and technical. The court found that the Justice Department had failed to properly specify which of the 3 possible grounds for denying conscientious objector status applied to Ali. The denial letter mentioned all 3 grounds without indicating which one the appeal board had relied upon. This procedural error invalidated the conviction. Crucially, the court did not rule on whether Ali's religious beliefs actually qualified him for conscientious objector status. The decision avoided that substantive question entirely, instead reversing the conviction on narrower procedural grounds. But the result was the same. Ali's conviction was overturned, the threat of prison removed, his legal vindication achieved. The Supreme Court victory came too late to restore the years stolen from Ali's prime. He was now 29 years old. The exile had cost him ages 25 through 28, precisely the years when heavyweights are at their physical peak. The loss to Frazier suggested that while Ali remained elite, he might never recapture the supernatural abilities that had defined his early career. Yet the legal victory, combined with the Frazier fight proving he could still compete at the highest level, gave Ali a platform to continue his career. The question now was whether he could overcome the Frazier defeat and reclaim the championship he'd never lost in the ring. Rumble in the jungle. Redemption in Zaire. The path from the March 1971 defeat to Joe Frazier back to the heavyweight championship was neither direct nor easy. Muhammad Ali, now vindicated legally but defeated athletically, faced the prospect of climbing back through the heavyweight rankings to earn another title shot. He was 29 years old, no longer the unbeatable force of his early 20s, forced to prove himself all over again. Ali fought 10 times between the Frazier loss and his next title opportunity, compiling a record of 9-1. The victories included respectable opponents like Floyd Patterson, Bob Foster, and Jerry Quarry in a rematch. But the loss was significant. A 12-round decision to Ken Norton on 31st March 1973, during which Norton broke Ali's jaw with a punch in the first round. Ali fought through the injury for 11 more rounds, demonstrating extraordinary toughness, but lost a split decision. The Norton defeat raised serious questions about Ali's future. 2 losses in his last 12 fights suggested decline. The broken jaw required surgery and months of recovery. Some observers argued that the exile's damage was now undeniable. Ali simply wasn't the fighter he'd been before being banned. He was slower, more hittable, less able to avoid punishment through superior movement. But Ali defeated Norton in a September 1973 rematch, winning a controversial split decision that many observers believed Norton deserved. The victory, whilst disputed, established Ali as a legitimate contender. When Joe Frazier lost his title to George Foreman in January 1973, demolished in 2 rounds by Foreman's devastating power, the heavyweight landscape changed dramatically. Foreman was everything Ali wasn't. He was 25 years old, undefeated in 40 fights with 37 knockouts, and possessed punching power that seemed almost superhuman. His destruction of Frazier, knocking him down 6 times in less than 6 minutes, shocked the boxing world. Foreman looked genuinely unstoppable, a puncher so devastating that no defense could withstand his assault. Yet Ali secured a title shot against Foreman, scheduled for 30th of October 1974 in Kinshasa, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The bout was promoted by Don King and funded by Zairean dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, who saw it as an opportunity to showcase his country on the world stage. The Rumble in the Jungle became one of the most famous sporting events in history. Ali entered the fight as a massive underdog. Most boxing experts predicted Foreman would knock him out, possibly early. The accumulated damage from the Frazier and Norton wars, combined with Ali's advancing age and Foreman's terrifying power, made Ali's chances seem minimal. Even Ali's corner harbored doubts about whether their fighter could survive Foreman's assault. But Ali had studied Foreman's previous fights and identified a potential weakness. Foreman's devastating power came from throwing heavy punches with bad intentions, an approach that required tremendous energy. If someone could survive the initial assault and force Foreman to punch himself into exhaustion, he might become vulnerable later in the fight. This strategy became the famous rope-a-dope. Ali leaned against the ropes, which were looser than normal, allowing him to lean back further and absorb some of Foreman's power through the ropes. Give. He covered up while Foreman unleashed combinations, deflecting or rolling with punches when possible, absorbing others, all whilst conserving his own energy. Round after round, Foreman threw everything at Ali. Massive hooks to the body, uppercuts with knockout power, combinations designed to break Ali down. Ali took tremendous punishment, but the ropes absorbed much of the force, and Ali's defensive skills, diminished but still superior to almost everyone else's, allowed him to survive what would have destroyed lesser fighters. Between rounds, Ali's trainer Angelo Dundee screamed at him to get off the ropes and box, terrified that the accumulated punishment would lead to catastrophic injury. But Ali stuck to his plan, trusting his ability to absorb punishment and his reading of Foreman's conditioning. By the 8th round, Foreman was exhausted. His punches, while still dangerous, had lost their snap. His arms felt like lead. He'd thrown everything at Ali for 7 rounds, and the stubborn champion was still standing, still talking, still taunting. Ali saw his opening. Foreman was vulnerable for the first time in the fight. Ali came off the ropes and unleashed a combination that caught Foreman flush. The champion, punched out and exhausted, went down. He rose at the count of 8, but referee Zach Clayton stopped the fight. Muhammad Ali, at 32 years old, 7 years after being stripped of his title for refusing military service, had done the impossible. He'd defeated the most feared puncher in heavyweight history and reclaimed the championship. The victory was more than athletic. It was redemption. Ali had proven that the exile hadn't destroyed him, that he could still compete at the highest level, that his will could overcome seemingly insurmountable physical disadvantages. The rope-a-dope became legendary, studied by boxing tacticians as an example of ring intelligence overcoming superior physical attributes. For Ali personally, the rumble in the jungle represented vindication on multiple levels. He'd sacrificed his title, his prime years, and millions of dollars for his religious beliefs and opposition to the Vietnam War. He'd been vilified, prosecuted, and banned. Yet he'd survived, legally vindicated by the Supreme Court, and now athletically vindicated by defeating Foreman. The price paid for those principles was enormous. The 3.5 years of exile had cost Ali his physical prime. The wars with Frazier, Norton, and Foreman took accumulated toll on his body and brain. Medical experts who later studied Ali's career argued that the punishment he absorbed after returning from exile, fights he might have avoided or won more easily if he'd been allowed to continue fighting through his mid-20s, contributed significantly to the Parkinson's syndrome that would afflict him in later life. But Ali never expressed regret about his decision to refuse induction. In interviews throughout his later life, even as Parkinson's made speaking difficult, he maintained that standing up for his beliefs was worth any cost. The Supreme Court had vindicated his legal position. History had vindicated his opposition to the Vietnam War, which by 1974 was widely recognized as a catastrophic mistake. And the rumble in the jungle had vindicated his belief that he could reclaim what had been taken from him. Muhammad Ali would continue fighting until 1981, defending and losing his title multiple times, absorbing further punishment that almost certainly worsened his neurological condition. But the rumble in the jungle represented his ultimate triumph, proof that courage, intelligence, and determination could overcome injustice, exile, and seemingly impossible odds. The young man who in 1967 had sacrificed everything for principle had, by 1974, proven that some things matter more than titles, money, or even physical well-being. Muhammad Ali had lost 3.5 years at his peak, but he'd gained something more valuable, a legacy as an athlete who stood for something larger than sport, who paid an enormous price for his beliefs, and who proved that redemption is possible even when the odds seem insurmountable.